I actually left the location with my son. He was not comfortable with it anymore.
And is he there by himself, or is there anyone else there?
He's there by himself.
Okay.
He is a professional fighter. I don't want no cop to get injured.
No, we don't want anyone to get hurt. What's your husband's name?
Tony Ferguson.
A man who built his legend on being the thing other trained killers feared in the dark. For over a decade, Tony Ferguson was chaos made flesh, turning the UFC's lightweight division into his personal nightmare factory. He kicked metal pipes to harden his shins, threw baseballs to sharpen his punches, and danced into battle like a psychotic ballerino before dismantling opponents with techniques that seemed to defy the laws of combat. But legends never last forever, and even the Boogeyman can become haunted. This is the rise and catastrophic fall of MMA's most uniquely disturbing fighter. A man who conquered every demon in the cage, except the ones inside his own mind. The story of how the nightmare became the victim of his own terror, and why the deadliest opponent is sometimes the reflection in the mirror. Tony Ferguson's transformation from broken-down bartender to UFC monster didn't happen overnight. It was forged through desperation, delusion, and an almost psychotic refusal to accept limitations. At 24, weighing over 200 pounds and smoking cigars behind a California bar, Ferguson was drowning in mediocrity.
All right, smokers unite.
The kind of existence where dreams don't die dramatically, they just slowly suffocate. Nights blurred into mornings, and the only fights he saw were between drunken strangers over spilled beer. He wasn't a failed fighter. He wasn't even a fighter. He was just another face in the crowd. Then came a moment so small it could have been forgotten, but it wasn't. A gym owner named Rufulio noticed him shadowboxing behind the bar after closing, half joking about getting in shape someday. Ferguson couldn't even afford gloves. Rufulio handed him a free pair and said, "Come by the gym." It wasn't a pep talk. It wasn't a life plan, just a simple gesture, but it was oxygen to a man who had been suffocating for years. From that day, Ferguson didn't just train, he obsessed. Where others saw workouts, he saw exorcisms. Every drop of sweat, every bruise, every ache was proof he was clawing his way out of the life that had almost swallowed him whole. While other fighters followed conventional programs, he built rituals that bordered on masochism, throwing baseballs to build punching power, kicking metal pipes to deaden his shins, somersaults and hammer swings on gym balls, like some deranged circus performer preparing for war. Pain became his language. Suffering became his closest companion. Coaches warned him it was too much. Ferguson smiled. Too much was the point. When the Ultimate Fighter finally accepted him on his third application, Ferguson didn't just win fights. He dismantled opponents psychologically before the cage door even closed. His cruelest moment came against teammate Charlie Rader, when he repeatedly taunted him about losing custody of his son.
Don't say it. Hey, where's your kid at? Don't say it.
With the calculated precision of someone who knew exactly where to twist the knife, it was a glimpse into the darkness that would one day consume him. But at the time, it looked like the mark of a born predator. His UFC debut was a statement written in blood and bone. Veteran Aaron Riley had his jaw shattered by a Ferguson uppercut in the first round. The referee waved it off, not because Riley was unconscious, but because he could no longer speak. Ferguson had arrived, and the lightweight division would never feel safe again. What followed was 4 years of systematic terror. Edson Barboza, a world-class striker, submitted to a Darce choke that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Rafael dos Anjos, a former champion, absorbed 199 significant strikes over 5 rounds of sustained violence. Donald Cerrone, the cowboy who never backed down, left with a broken orbital bone from a spinning elbow so vicious it looked like performance art. Ferguson wasn't just winning fights, he was creating trauma, leaving opponents with injuries that would haunt them long after the bruises faded. While Ferguson was painting the lightweight division red with his chaotic artistry, another fighter was quietly building a perfect storm in the mountains of Dagestan. Khabib Nurmagomedov represented everything Ferguson was not: methodical where Tony was erratic, controlled where Tony was wild, disciplined where Tony thrived in madness. Two polar forces on a collision course, or so it seemed.
Took it, Khabib.
Their first scheduled meeting, December 2015, ended before it began.
Injury for the Russian fighter. This time it's a rib injury.
Khabib's knee gave out just weeks before the fight. Ferguson, already deep in camp, turned his frustration on Edson Barboza, submitting the Brazilian with a Darce choke that seemed to materialize from pure malice. But the seed had been planted. Khabib became the one man standing between Tony and lightweight immortality. The universe, however, had other plans. April 2016, canceled again. This time when Ferguson's lungs failed medical clearance. March 2017. A disaster weight cut sent Khabib to the hospital just hours before they were set to meet. Ferguson's reaction was swift and merciless, mocking Khabib's love of tiramisu, turning a dietary slip into a viral insult that would follow both men for years. When Ferguson finally fought Kevin Lee for the interim title, it felt like destiny correcting itself. The belt should have guaranteed him the fight he'd been chasing. Instead, it became a cruel joke. While Tony held the interim crown, Khabib fought Al Iaquinta for the real championship. Ferguson was stripped of a title he'd never lost, forced to watch his rival ascend to the throne that should have been his. Then came the fourth booking. April 2018, UFC 223 Fight Week. A routine media day, a camera crew, a simple walk through the studio, and one loose cable. Ferguson tripped. His knee exploded. Years of preparation, sacrifice, and obsession were undone in an instant. The man who had survived countless wars in the cage was taken down by a piece of wire. And somewhere, it felt like destiny wasn't just laughing. It was closing a door that would never open again. The man who had spent his career mastering psychological warfare against opponents was now losing a far more dangerous battle, one waged entirely within his own mind. By 2019, years of relentless pursuit, accumulated trauma, and the obsessive need for perfection were twisting into something that terrified those closest to him. Tony Ferguson, once feared for being unpredictably dangerous, was becoming unpredictable in a way that had nothing to do with fighting. It began with sleepless nights that bled into days, his mind racing with conspiracies that made perfect sense to him, and horrified his wife, Christina. He became convinced that tracking devices had been implanted in his leg during knee surgery, considering cutting himself open to dig out what wasn't there. The refrigerator, filled with hidden cameras, the ceiling fans, government surveillance equipment. Every shadow hid a watcher, every reflection a threat. The paranoia that once sharpened his edge in the cage was now erasing his ability to separate reality from delusion. In the middle of the night, Ferguson shook his family awake, insisting they had to flee. Catastrophic flooding was coming. He drove them over 100 miles away, convinced he alone could save them from a disaster that existed only in his fractured mind. When no flood came, he promised to get help. The promise lasted days. Soon, Christina was living with a stranger who wore her husband's face but spoke in riddles about witchcraft and poison. He hurled holy water at her, certain she'd been replaced by something evil. He destroyed their son's food, believing it was poisoned. He ripped mirrors from walls, hunting enemies that existed only in the shadows of his imagination. The woman who had once loved the fighter now feared the man sharing her bed, watching helplessly as Tony disappeared into a maze he couldn't escape. When Ferguson returned to competition against Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone in June 2019, it seemed, for 10 minutes, that the Boogeyman was back. He pressured, spun, and sliced with surgical precision, leaving Cerrone battered and bloodied. But even in victory, something felt wrong. The controversial punch thrown after the bell that broke Cerrone's orbital bone wasn't the calculated chaos Ferguson was known for. It was a flash of something uncontrolled, something unmoored. He earned the win, and with it, the long-awaited title shot. But to those who truly knew him, the man climbing toward gold was carrying wounds that no amount of training could close. March 2020 brought the global pandemic that would finally do what injuries, botched weight cuts, and freak accidents could not. Trap Khabib Nurmagomedov in Russia, seemingly killing their cursed rivalry for good. Any rational fighter might have waited for borders to reopen, for the world to steady, for the fight that had defined a career to finally materialize. But Tony Ferguson had never been rational, and by then, desperation had long since replaced logic. Ferguson made a choice that broke every rule of fight preparation. He would cut weight twice in 3 weeks. Already depleted from training for Khabib, he agreed to face Justin Gaethje, a human wrecking ball whose calling card was ending careers through raw, unrelenting violence. It was the kind of decision that made veterans wince, the equivalent of a wounded animal limping into a predator's den. His team knew it was madness. His wife knew it was madness. Deep down, Ferguson probably knew it too, but accepting that his greatest rivalry would never be resolved was a reality he simply refused to face. Gaethje entered UFC 249 with one mission: destroy Tony Ferguson so completely there'd be no doubt who deserved the next title shot. For 4.5 rounds, he executed with chilling precision. Ferguson's unpredictability, his ability to thrive in chaos, collapsed under Gaethje's disciplined brutality. Every exchange left Ferguson's face more mangled, his footwork slower, his legendary recovery pushed to breaking. The end came with methodical cruelty. By the 5th round, Ferguson was running on muscle memory alone, his left eye swollen shut, blood tracing rivers across his face. Gaethje toyed with him like a predator, prolonging the kill, pawing at the damage, snapping jabs into wounds that should have stopped the fight long before. When Herb Dean finally stepped in, Ferguson wasn't just beaten. He was shattered in a way no camera could fully capture. Afterward, he sat motionless against the cage, staring into the void. The aura was gone. The chaos that had once been his greatest weapon had been revealed as his most fatal flaw when met with calculated violence. From Dagestan, Khabib Nurmagomedov spoke the most prophetic words of Ferguson's career. When you take damage like this, you're never gonna be sane. Never, ever. The Boogeyman who had haunted the lightweight division for a decade had finally met something more terrifying than himself: the limits of human endurance. What followed the Gaethje massacre wasn't just a losing streak. It was the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Tony Ferguson terrifying. The man who had built his legend on being impossible to finish suddenly became shockingly mortal. Charles Oliveira, a grappler Ferguson's ground game should have neutralized, wrapped him in a submission that nearly tore his arm apart. For the first time in his UFC career, El Cucuy tapped. The sight of his hand hitting the canvas wasn't just a defeat, it was the death of his mystique. Beneil Dariush widened the cracks in the armor, outstriking the striker, out-wrestling the wrestler, and making Ferguson look ordinary in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The footwork that had once resembled a deadly ballet now stumbled and stalled. The spinning attacks that used to erupt from nowhere telegraphed themselves like bad amateur theater. Commentators began saying what had once been unthinkable: this isn't the same Tony Ferguson we remember. Then came Michael Chandler, and the knockout that erased all doubt. 17 seconds into the second round, Chandler's front kick detonated on Ferguson's chin with the precision of an execution. He lay motionless, staring at the lights while medics swarmed. When he finally spoke, it was to thank his team for not giving up on me. Words heavy with the weight of a man who knew he was clinging to the wreckage of his former self. The defeats piled up with cruel inevitability. Nate Diaz picked him apart on the feet, making Ferguson swing at ghosts while eating clean shots. Bobby Green, a journeyman meant to rebuild his confidence, delivered another punishing loss that showcased just how far Ferguson had fallen. Each fight revealed new weaknesses, new limitations, new proof that the Boogeyman had become just another aging fighter chasing the echoes of his prime. The cruelest irony was that Ferguson's own style, the chaos that once made him untouchable, became the weapon of his undoing. Years of willingly absorbing punishment in the name of violence had accrued like compound interest. His low hands, once a display of supreme confidence, now served as a target. The granite chin that had absorbed bombs from the division's elite finally crumbled under the weight of accumulated trauma. Tony Ferguson had always fought as if he were indestructible, but reality had been keeping score. And when the bill came due, it demanded everything. Defeat did not break Tony Ferguson's spirit, not at first. To the outside world, he was still El Cucuy, still the Boogeyman, still the man who trained in shadows and prepared for war in ways no sane athlete would. But to those paying closer attention, the mask was starting to slip. The chaos had become caricature, the confidence a brittle facade barely holding together under the weight of reality. Social media became his new battleground. Training clips surfaced of Ferguson smashing medicine balls, throwing spinning elbows into invisible enemies, balancing on exercise equipment like a circus acrobat while sweat poured from his face. To casual fans, it was proof that the old Tony was alive and plotting his return. To the fight community, it was something darker, evidence of a man chasing ghosts, trying to recreate magic that had long since slipped through his fingers. In interviews, Ferguson spoke with the same wild conviction that had once terrified opponents. He talked about making another run at the belt, about snapping necks and cashing checks, about being 2 fights away from a title shot. But now the words landed differently. The smirk looked forced. The eyes told a different story. The once celebrated unpredictability sounded less like confidence and more like denial. Press conferences became uncomfortable theater. Ferguson still cracked jokes, still shadowboxed between questions, still wore the sunglasses indoors. But opponents didn't flinch anymore. They smiled. They saw the same man the audience saw, a warrior who didn't realize the war was already over. The MMA community split into 2 camps. Half begged him to walk away while he still had his health, urging him to preserve what was left of the legend. The other half watched like rubberneckers at a car crash, unable to look away from the slow unraveling of a once unstoppable force. Ferguson heard them all and ignored them all. He'd built his career on defying logic, and in his mind, this was just another round to survive. But there was an unspoken truth hanging over every fight announcement, every stare down, every walk to the cage. This was no longer the Boogeyman hunting in the dark. This was a man fighting shadows, his opponents, the fans, and the cruelest one of all, time. There comes a moment in every fighter's life when the cage door closes, and it's not about titles, rankings, or legacy anymore. It's about survival. For Tony Ferguson, that moment didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, fight by fight, loss by loss, until it was impossible to ignore. By 2024, the man who had once carved his name into lightweight history with chaos and violence was walking into arenas to polite applause rather than the roar of fear and anticipation. His entrances still had the music, the sunglasses, the swagger, but the energy was different. Fans weren't there to see the Boogeyman do his worst. They were there to see if there was anything left. Inside the cage, time was now his most relentless opponent. The reflexes that once let him slip a punch by millimeters were gone, replaced by delayed reactions and heavy legs. The wild scrambles that used to end with Ferguson snatching a limb now ended with him pinned to the canvas, fighting for breath. He still threw the spinning elbows, the cartwheel kicks, the unpredictable combinations. Between fights, he kept talking about one last run, about proving everyone wrong. And maybe he believed it, or maybe deep down, he knew that the octagon was the only place where the noise in his head went quiet. Retirement meant reflection, and reflection meant facing the truth, that the sport he loved had taken pieces of him he would never get back. The final chapter of Tony Ferguson's career wasn't written with a single knockout or a tearful goodbye in the cage. It was written in the accumulation of damage, in the slow fading of the spark that once made him untouchable. It was in the way opponents stopped fearing him and started respecting him as a relic of a brutal era. When the end finally comes, and it will, it won't be because Tony Ferguson decided to stop fighting. It will be because the fight has finally left him. And when that day arrives, the MMA world will look back and remember not the losing streak, not the decline, but the years when El Cucuy stalked the lightweight division like a phantom. breaking bodies and minds with a style that could never be replicated. Because for a time, Tony Ferguson wasn't just a fighter, he was a force of nature. And forces of nature don't retire. They fade into legend, leaving only the stories, the scars, and the lingering question of what might have been had fate ever allowed him his dance with Khabib Nurmagomedov. If you were there for the rise, and you've stayed through the fall, you know Tony Ferguson's story is more than just wins and losses. It's a cautionary tale, a testament to madness, brilliance, and the price of chasing greatness. Don't just remember the record, remember the man. Share his story,